Hey folks, I thought I would show off another design I made in Minecraft. It's actually a working nuclear reactor with active cooling. It uses two mods. One is IndustrialCraft2 for the reactor, and the other is RedPower2 for the cooling system. I've seen other people do similar designs, so I didn't come up with this idea, but it is my design for this particular reactor, and I thought I'd go ahead and show it off. So to start, I'll give a quick overview. It's composed of a few buildings. This is the control room. Over here is the containment structure for the reactor itself. Here's the cooling tower, and back here is a small building that I use to store power. Um, Still work in progress. I'm not completely happy with the way everything looks yet, but it is all operational, so I'll go ahead and shut off. Here's the control room. It's pretty simple. There's two buttons. There's a start reactor button, and then there's a stop/reset button, and then there's various status indicator lights. So if I were to hit start, you can see the reactor starts up. The yellow light starts blinking. Sometimes it doesn't blink. I think that's a lag thing, but anyway, it blinks, and that's basically indicating that the reactor is warming up, which really means the reactor hasn't started yet, but the cooling system's on. So green means that the reactor is now generating power. It's being cooled actively. And then there's a couple other indicator lights. Currently, I actually purposely took a bunch of water buckets out of the system, which is what's used to cool it, to cause it to fault. And so here in a few seconds, you'll see that the reactor will detect that there's not enough cooling. It will shut itself down as a safety feature, and the red lights will begin blinking. And then also the blue light will blink, which indicates that the reactor is going to be cooling still, even though it's shut off. So that's kind of what you're seeing now, is the reactor has basically said, okay, I don't have enough cooling, and it can't operate in a safe condition, so it shuts itself down, and the red lights indicate that. So if I were to hit restart now, it doesn't allow me to start because it's in a fault condition, so the only way to restart it at this point is I have to reset it, which actually stops the red lights. And then if I were to restart it again, it would probably fault again. So what I have to do is, after I restart it, which you'll see it starts up, I'm going to run over here. Actually, I'm going to run down here. This is the circuitry, which I'll explain in a little bit, but I need to put buckets into the system. So once I put buckets in this chest, you can see they immediately start getting pulled out and being fed up above us, which is where the reactor is. Actually, even that number of buckets isn't enough. I need to grab another stack of them. And when I put those in there, that should be sufficient. So you can see a bunch of buckets are headed up, and then there's a bunch coming down too, which I'll explain in a second. So the reactor is above us. It's up here. And here now you can see the reactor's kind of hit a steady state. There's buckets, empty buckets coming from the reactor in this tube being fed out here, and then there's full ones coming back. And so the empty ones actually end up in the cooling tower, and I took this wall away so you can see, but they end up in this deployer. So the empty buckets come in, they get filled with water, and then this filter will immediately pull full buckets out and send them back. So you can see that once it hits steady state, there's a stream of empty buckets coming from the reactor and full buckets being fed back to it. So the reactor itself is up here. It's composed of 5 chambers, and the way reactors work in IndustrialCraft2 is pretty much the top row is the only thing that allows buckets to be. If this was an empty reactor, only the top row would have buckets. Sometimes I see the second row have a few, but anything beyond that gets ejected out. I actually don't have this filled with uranium. There's some other cells, depleted isotope cells, and I'm re-enriching them. But I could fill this with uranium, and it would generally do okay. Actually, right now, this current design, it can't handle a completely filled reactor. It would still overheat. But I could actually modify it to make it handle that. But this generates plenty of power for me. But you can see that there's buckets coming in, fill buckets, and then they immediately, water evaporates and they get pulled out. And that just happens over and over again. And so that's constantly cooling the reactor, and it keeps it in a safe condition. And then there's a bunch of buckets that are being ejected, and this is how I detect whether the reactor is operating in a safe environment or not. So I actually have water here, and this water is not really to cool the reactor, although it does help. It's mainly to keep buckets. You can see that one kind of ended up on the pipe, or the tube, and it keeps them from getting stuck. So what I want is any ejected buckets to get fed back down and get recycled into the system, and that's what these, you can see there's a floor full of transposers on the bottom, which actually take any buckets and send them back in. So like I said, any ejected buckets wind up down here, and they get counted. This is an item detector, so anything that comes, they come through these tubes, and they get counted here. And so what this item detector does is it pulses every time a bucket goes through it. And this pulse ends up on this counter right here. And so this is I have this counter set to 20 max count. And so it increments once every second, and every time a bucket goes through it, it basically resets. It decrements by 20. So what this effectively does is it makes it so that if there isn't a bucket ejected at least every 20 seconds, then the system will fault and shut itself down. So just because a bucket doesn't get ejected doesn't necessarily mean the reactor is going to explode, but it does mean the reactor is probably not operating in a safe condition, and so that's why it shuts itself down. And so this timer right here is set to 1 second, which is why it takes 20 seconds for that to occur. So I can actually cause that to happen if I were to take this pipe out, and now buckets, instead of getting fed back in the system, ejected buckets are just kind of falling on the floor here. And in a very short period of time, that's going to cause the system to fault. So you'll see that there's still some ejected buckets. So actually you saw it there where it reset it, but I think this time there's another one. But within 20 seconds or so, there won't be any more buckets getting ejected, and the system will fault out. And so this circuit is mostly just counters and RS latches to latch different states. So it's not super complex. But there's a fault, it latches the fault, and then that causes this red light to blink, and it shuts off the reactor. At the same time, there's a timer that keeps this light on for a while, which is actually the cooling light, or it indicates that the cooling system's still on. And you can see that this is basically still moving, which means the cooling system's still on. So if I were to put this back, you can see buckets will start getting fed back into the system, but the system's actually shut down at this point because it's faulted. So I can go and reset it again up here. And as you can see, the system's in a fault state like it should be. So I reset it and restart it. And I'm just going to show kind of how much power the reactor puts out at this point. Again, I'm not maxing it out by any means. I could get a lot more power out of it, but it still generates plenty of power for my uses, and a lot more than you would be able to get safely without this. So this line's putting out 100 EU, this is 100, and this one's actually 0 just because the thing it's feeding is full. So that's 200 EU per tick, which is quite a bit. I could get a lot higher if I was pushing the system, but again I'm not. And but it works pretty well. It's very reliable. I haven't had it explode ever, and I think it's kind of cool. So hopefully you enjoyed watching this video, and thanks for watching.